I've been wanting to expand on my bud vase range for a while now. These are the small vases I've been making for a number of years now, with an inset opening with walls that slope down to it. And lately I found myself thinking about and sketching out a few ideas for more significant standalone pieces. And in this video, I'll be showing you the process of throwing one of these. But first I need to clear an area to wedge my clay and prepare it for the wheel. I also need to fetch my throwing tools, which were washed and left drying overnight, ready for today. When I'm throwing, I try not to be overloaded with too many tools. Rather, I prefer using a simple set of pieces I'm well acquainted with. This way there's never too much to clean up come the end of the day. This is my usual high iron stoneware clay body which I throw with, and this is a batch of soft reclaim, meaning it's scrap clay trimmed away from previously thrown vessels, slaked down in water, and then put onto plaster bats, and then once it's dry enough I wedge it up back into a usable state. And this process of spiral wedging removes any small pockets of air that might still remain in the body, as well as making sure that the texture is completely even throughout. You don't want there to be firmer or softer lumps within the piece of clay you're working with, especially when you're throwing on the wheel. So before that process can begin, it always needs to be wedged. Or it can be mixed in a pug mill too, a de-airing one, and maybe, like I keep telling myself, perhaps I'll purchase one of those for myself soon. With the clay prepped, I'll quickly clean up the area I was wedging on. And then I can move over to the wheel, ready to throw. I use a Roder HMT 500 to do most of my throwing, and directly to my left I keep a bucket of water with a sharp plastic edge which I can scrape my hands against to remove the slip, which makes picking pots off the wheel much easier, and it means I don't have to clean my hands off with a towel, which means that the entire process when production throwing is a lot less dusty, which I'm sure my lungs will be thankful for. And with the ball of clay prepped, I slam it firmly against the wheel, cover it in water, and begin the centering process. I begin by squeezing my hands tightly around the bottom of the lump of clay to make sure it's really sealed against the metal wheel head. Next, I'll begin to cone the clay up and down numerous times, which sort of acts like wedging on the wheel, which should make the lump of clay more plastic and easier to throw with. As I'm coning, I make sure the lump of clay has a rounded top. This way, as it's forced upwards, it doesn't create a hollow on the very top, which does happen if you leave the lump of clay flat or with a slight indent on the top. And it's a good thing to avoid if possible, as otherwise you can trap slip and air within the lump of clay you're trying to so carefully centre, which sort of defeats the purpose of this process. Once the lump of clay feels like it's running beneath my hands very smoothly, I'll flatten the top, and I'll watch my hands to make sure that they aren't wobbling whatsoever, which is a good indicator that the clay is running perfectly in the middle. I then scrape the sticky slip off the wheel head and deposit it on the top of the lump of clay to help hydrate it, and then I forcefully plunge my index finger and thumb straight into the centre, keeping those digits really firmly tensed, whilst also retaining some kind of hold on the outside of the lump of clay to contain it. I push down until the base is about 5 mm thick, and then I run my fingertips horizontally across the bottom to create the internal floor of the pot and to compress the clay, something that should prevent cracks from occurring and a few other issues. And after it's been formed to my liking, I can then collar in this lump of clay from the outside, squeezing the walls both in and upwards in one motion, and setting the foundations for the rest of the throwing process. I compress the thick rim with both hands to make sure it's spinning entirely level and without any undulations in it. It's a step I'll repeat numerous times throughout this process, especially after each pull, which is what you see my hands now doing. The thick expanse of clay near the bottom is pinched between fingers both inside and out, and very gradually, in one even, smooth motion, I draw both hands up the walls together. And with this first pull, really I'm just trying to thin out walls that were really thick, and hereafter I'll begin pushing in a lot more with a soaked sponge on the outside, which I initially push in with the wheel spinning very quickly as to create an even groove at the very bottom. My fingers on the inside then push out to form the bulge you can see travelling up the walls of the pot, and with my right hand that soaked wet sponge is positioned underneath this bulge, and with each pull I'm essentially lifting up that lump of clay I'm pushing out from the inside. After each pull, it helps to collar the walls in slightly, so the walls don't begin angling out too much. It also helps me keep the rim under control, which, for a pot like this, where the rim will eventually be thrown inwards and even down slightly, is of paramount importance. And to aid that process even further, I make sure to leave the rim relatively thick throughout this entire procedure, as it's going to be thrown and altered quite a lot towards the end, and if there's not enough material to work with, well, throwing this type of pot just won't be possible. As I pull the walls of clay up, I make sure I move at an even rate, as if I keep my hands pinched in one position for too long, it's very easy to create a thin spot in the walls, which will eventually lead to the pot buckling and even collapsing depending on where that thin spot is. Thankfully, the initial thrown shape I'm aiming for is relatively simple. I want the base shape to be relatively tall and bulbous, with the widest point being somewhere in the top third of the pot. And now, as I'm pulling the walls up, I'm also shaping the vessel, and I'm actively thinking about the shape I want as I pull the walls up. Between each pull, I make sure there's enough water on the vessel, especially when my hand is gripping around the top and on the inside of the walls, as if you feel like the clay is drying out beneath your fingertips. That's when your digits will begin to stick to that tacky clay, and when that does happen, it can draw the whole piece off center, either just a little bit or a lot. And it's for this reason why for larger pieces I prefer using a soaked sponge on the outside, as it means there's a constant stream of hydration, as I can just gently squeeze the sponge as I'm pushing it up the wall, and a bit more water or slip will be deposited where my hand is. The only downside with using a sponge is that you do sort of lose a bit of the tactile sensation, and for me personally, I just find it a bit more difficult to judge the thickness of the walls through the sponge, as opposed to if I was just using my fingertips for this process. And once my hands reach the top and I conclude the pull, I always release them very gently, as at any point throughout this process, if you remove your hands very suddenly from the pot, there's a high possibility you'll leave quite a dramatic undulation in the vessel where your hands left it. And letting go gently is the way to prevent that. Now that the rough shape's there, I can begin tidying up the pot and throw in the more distinct angles I want. And typically speaking, I always start from the bottom and work my way up. And instead of pushing the sharp metal edge into the clay, I instead hold it just on the surface of the pot and then push out from the inside against the metal. This way, the shape is kept how I want it, and I can scrape away more of the slip that covers the outside of the form without distorting the pot too much. If I were to just push the metal into the clay without any resistance on the inside, then I'd just push the walls in, and I'd have a much more difficult time achieving the shape I actually want. One of my general rules when throwing these types of vase forms with a narrow tapering base is that the lowest tapering section should account for roughly half of the entire height of the pot. If it's any lower, these vases can begin to look quite stumpy and bottom heavy, which even though this is just a simple rounded vessel, in its most simple form, I want it to retain some degree of elegance. Now, before I do more shaping at the top, I'll blast the two sections I've scraped slip off with this heat gun, as at this point, the clay that's been stretched out the most around the waist is quite thin, and even just the process of collaring in the top like this is enough to alter the shape beneath it if the clay is too soft. And if you look really carefully at the waist of the pot at this stage, you'll see that the dry facet around the waist is actually slightly curved outward as the soft apex of the pot gradually moves out. But as long as it doesn't go too far, I should be able to correct it later. As for throwing the top, as I left myself with enough material to work with, there's easily enough stoneware to collar in to form the shoulder and the inward sloping rim. My left hand supports the clay from underneath as I push quite firmly inwards with the index finger of my right hand, forcing the clay over the supportive fingers on the inside, and obtaining the shape of the top is something I'll do bit by bit instead of rushing it. And if I feel like everything's getting just a bit too precarious, I'll use the heat gun again and blast the walls of the pot, just to firm everything up and make it a bit more stable. And now the shoulder's been thrown, I'll begin pushing the rim inwards and slowly sloping it down. It's worth noting that if you are using a heat gun to dry out the walls of your pot, it really helps if you remove all the slip from the walls before heating them, as this way you're not having to dry out all that slip first before it can dry out the clay underneath it. The more I make of these bud vases, the more I realise that the smaller the opening is, the more interesting the feature becomes. And there's a grey zone I've encountered a number of times, where I've made the opening not quite small enough, resulting in a vessel that just doesn't feel right, as if there's something clumsy about it. So these days, typically, I'll throw them smaller if needs be, if anything. And then if the opening does need to be made slightly wider, I can just make that correction when I'm trimming it at the leather hard stage. With the form almost there, almost entirely enclosed, I'll begin scraping the slip off the last 2 remaining facets. First the shoulder, and then the rim, and for this I've switched to a plastic kidney. As it's not quite so sharp, there's less of a chance that it'll catch or snag on the clay as it dries out. And now as this top wall of clay is really thin, before I angle it downward, I'll give it one last blast with the heat gun. And apologies for blocking the view here with my fingers, but essentially all I'm doing is using the flat portion of the kidney to very gently ease the rim down so that it's sloping below the ridge above it. When I make the smaller bud vases, like shown at the beginning of this video, I don't bother using a heat gun. Instead I just leave the clay a little bit thick, angle it, and then trim it back later. But for a larger piece like this, it just makes sense to be more careful, and the time that's added with the heat gun doesn't really matter, as I'm only making 1 or 2 pots that are this shape, as opposed to 30 or 40 of the other ones, where using a heat gun excessively would add a huge amount of time to the overall process. And so I can lift the pot off neatly without distorting the lower half, I'll give those walls one last blast before wiring it off and lifting it away. It's a simple shape, and I really can't wait to see how these look glazed, which should hopefully happen really soon, as I'm about to enter the glazing and firing stage of my making cycle. Anyway, that's all for this week. Thank you, as always, for taking the time to watch these videos. It really means a lot, so let me know if you did. And like always, I'll see you next week.